Welcome to the show called 6 Events That Changed the World. On today's show, we're going to talk about 6 events that changed the world. Many historical events have occurred throughout the many decades and centuries of planet Earth. On today's show, we're going to take a look at 6 events that changed the world. Our first event that changed the world is World War II, September 1st, 1939 to September 2nd, 1945. This was a war to end all wars. Here in this picture are 6 Marines raising the American flag on February 22nd, 1945 after the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This place in this picture is called Mount Suribachi. On December 7th, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy attacks Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The Imperial Japanese Navy destroys several U.S. battleships and kills nearly 2,500 military and civilian personnel. On December 8, 1941, the late President Franklin D. Roosevelt declares war on Imperial Japan for attacking Pearl Harbor. FDR's famous speech, which he stated this day shall live in infamy, forever changed the world." On December 11, 1941, Nazi Germany declares war on the U.S. just 4 days after the Imperial Japanese Navy attacks Pearl Harbor. Now we'll take a look at some pictures and events of World War II seen in the next few pictures. The war ends with Imperial Japan on August 6, 1945, when the U.S. drops the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. The war with Nazi Germany was coming to an end on June 6, 1944, with the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1941. This is what Mount Suribachi, Japan looks like today. The next event that changed the world is called the sinking of the RMS Titanic. Here's a diagram picture of the RMS Titanic, how it was designed. What changed the world with this ship was the famous saying everybody said about it. Not even God himself could sink the Titanic. RMS Titanic skipper, Captain Edward J. Smith, 1850 to 1912, 62 years old. Served as a British merchant navy officer, served on various different vessels with the White Star Line fleet. Captain Smith went down with the Titanic on April 15, 1912, and his body was never recovered. The next few pictures will show the maiden voyage of the Titanic, some of its inside materials, and finally striking the iceberg and sinking. Titanic's maiden voyage, April 10th, 1912. The Grand Stairway. The next few pictures will show the inside of the Titanic. Titanic sailing along on the North Atlantic Ocean. Titanic strikes iceberg around 2 a.m. Flares are shot into the night sky. Titanic sinks in the North Atlantic Ocean in 2 hours and 40 minutes. About 1,500 souls died in the maritime disaster, and Captain Smith goes down with the ship. Our next event that changed the world is The 1963 assassination of the late President John F. Kennedy. The late President John F. Kennedy, 35th President of the United States of America. Born on May 29, 1927, died on November 22, 1963. President from January 20th, 1961 to November 22, 1963. The Kennedy family with Father Joseph, seen here in this picture. President Kennedy's inauguration day on January 20th, 1961. Lieutenant J.G. John F. Kennedy during World War II. He served on the PT-109 in the Pacific Fleet fighting against the Imperial Japanese Navy. Lieutenant J.G. Kennedy commanding the PT-109. Kennedy with some of his crew members on board the PT-109. PT-109 on patrol in the Pacific Ocean. Japanese destroyer Amerigara that cut the PT-109 in half. Here's a comparison size of the two ships. PT-109 is cut in half by a Japanese destroyer Amerigara sinking it and killing all crew members but 12 of them. Kennedy saves 12 of his men and is made a naval hero. Kennedy's most famous speech says this: "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what can you do for your country?" This famous saying helped change the way Americans think about America. Here, JFK gives the famous speech to put a man on the moon. The naval blockade of Russian ships trying to deliver missiles to Cuba, October 26, 1962. We now take a look at some of JFK's events in the next few pictures when he was in office. Now take a look at some pictures of the assassination of JFK on November 22nd, 1963. John F. Kennedy Jr. famous hand salute to his deceased father. Our next world-changing event we are going to talk about is Apollo 1 fire disaster. January 27, 1967 forever changed the world when this disaster happened. Being an astronaut is a rewarding and exciting career, but it can also be a dangerous job as well. Here, the 3 Apollo 1 astronauts pray before their training begins. Astronaut Virgil L. Grissom, Astronaut Edward B. White, Astronaut Roger B. Chaffee. We now take a brief look at Apollo 1's training. The four desperate words that forever changed the world were these words. Fire in the cockpit. What the Apollo 1 space capsule looked like after the fire. Flowers laid out for the outpouring of grief and the death of Apollo 1 astronauts. The funeral for Apollo 1 astronauts. Today in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a planetarium is named in memory of astronaut Roger B. Chaffee, where he was from. An air museum is named after astronaut Virgil I. Grissom in Peru, Indiana. Here's a picture of the White Memorial Chapel named after astronaut Edward B. White in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our next event that forever changed the world is the Vietnam War, November 1st, 1955 to April 30th, 1975. Here's a map of South Vietnam that was divided into zones. 1st Battalion U.S. 6th Infantry arrives in South Vietnam. About 350,000 U.S. soldiers are deployed to South Vietnam in 1955. About 700 military advisors are sent to South Vietnam as well. Here is a map of the divided Vietnam. The dividing line between North and South Vietnam was called the DMZ, or Demilitarized Zone. This was established by the Geneva Convention Conference in 1954. The commander of the Vietnam War is shown in this picture. This man was a four-star general, General William Westmoreland. Most Americans called this war Johnson's War because it was an undeclared war. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was perhaps the one thing that drew the U.S. more into the Vietnam conflict. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox was on patrol near the North Vietnam waters. They claimed to be in international waters. 3 North Vietnamese boats approached the Maddox as the Maddox shot fire warnings into the air. The North Vietnam torpedo boats kept pursuing the Maddox, and the Maddox opened fire on them. In the end, 4 North Vietnam sailors are killed, 6 wounded, and some of their vessels are damaged, but no U.S. casualties damaged to the ships. The 36th President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, tells American people he does not want war with North Vietnam. This was the most of the time called Johnson's War because it was undeclared. We now travel back in time to view some pictures of the Vietnam War. Night after night, the Vietnam conflict is broadcasted on the news into Americans' living room. Day after day, the Americans protest against the Vietnam conflict. America is divided in this conflict. Here, the late 37th President of America makes the historical announcement that would forever change America. We are going to make a peaceful and honorable withdrawal from South Vietnam. The famous rescue tower where U.S. Army helicopters try to rescue as many South Vietnamese people as possible before the fall of Saigon happens. Today, the memorial wall stands in Washington, D.C. Thousands of Americans visit this memorial every year. Some 58,195 U.S. soldiers killed in action during this conflict's names are forever etched on this memorial. Our final event that forever changed the world is Apollo 11. On July 16, 1968, Apollo 11 astronauts would be launched into space and would forever change the world. Apollo 11 crew would sit on top of the mighty Saturn V rocket waiting to make history. After Apollo 8 would become the first Apollo mission to reach the moon and orbit it, Apollo 11 would become the first Apollo mission to land a man on the moon. On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 astronauts lift off the launch pad from Cape Kennedy in Florida. Astronauts Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins would soon make history. Astronaut Buzz Aldrin, astronaut Michael Collins, astronaut Neil Armstrong. America had learned from its terrible tragedy from Apollo 1. Now, after 3 successful Apollo missions before this one, the late President JFK's dream to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade was becoming a reality. The next few pictures will show some of the highlights of the Apollo 11 moon mission. The famous words in this event that forever changed the world will be in the following in the next picture. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. We now travel back in time to see some more pictures of the Apollo 11 historical mission. The Apollo 11 moon mission forever changed the way the world viewed spaceflight. Indeed, Apollo 11's success was a good reprieve from watching all the bad news about the Vietnam conflict. Well, that is all for today's show on events that changed the world. Please join us for our next episode of Events That Changed the World.